Blighty Thank God is based on the diary our family discovered my late father, Ron Chapman, wrote in 1943 when he was a young RAF pilot serving in the Middle East and Italy.
In this grave hour,
I'm Neil Chapman and a former journalist. The podcast highlights the stories I uncovered when I researched his diary along with other historical sources. This extra episode to the series came about when an historical author researching her grandfather's career discovered my father's thoughts on the mysterious plane crash that claimed her grandfather's life. Early in my father's diary, he records being part of a search mission for a missing plane. The Blighty Thank God episode Death in Winter tells how his new squadron leader, George Milnes from New Zealand, was the pilot of a Hudson aircraft, EW-969, that took off from the Iranian capital Tehran on January the 18th, 1943, despite atrocious weather. It was headed for Baghdad, Iraq. The plane and passengers were due to fly on to Cairo, Egypt. On board were the RAF crew and 4 senior Iranian military, with 3 accompanying British diplomats, one of them a British spy. 26 minutes into the flight, the aircraft signalled it was returning to Tehran. Then silence. 6 days later, the wreckage and bodies of those on board were found in mountains about 100 kilometres southwest of Tehran by Iranian cavalrymen. One person who listened to the Blighty Thank God episode with particular interest was award-winning author and historian Jessie Childs. Stephen Childs, one of the diplomats killed in the crash, was her grandfather. That led to a conversation with Jessie about Mr. Childs and his colourful career, the complex affairs of another passenger on board that fateful flight, and discussing whether they all could have been unwitting victims of an assassination attempt on the Shah of Iran. My father's diary commentary on the plane going missing reveals that only scraps of information were filtering through from Tehran to RAF Habbaniya in Iraq, where he was. Poor weather hampered the desperate search operations, which were given added urgency by reports of ground-fired flares being spotted. The flares meant that some of the people on board could have survived. But my father was pessimistic about the plane and passengers' chances from the very start.
Here Milnes had left Tehran with lots of bigwigs aboard but had to return owing to wireless trouble. Bags of flamp and bullshit. He hasn't reached Tehran. Milnes definitely lost.
Later, my father highlights that the then young Shah of Iran was rumoured to have been one of the plane's passengers. But he chose not to travel.
Maybe right. If so, he was bloody lucky. There is more in this than we know about.
That last comment certainly piqued Jessie's interest. My father's suspicions about the crash may have been based purely on intuition, but knowing subsequent history and with the benefit of hindsight, his suspicions were insightful. The Shah ascended to the throne in 1941, replacing his father, who was deposed when the British and Russians invaded Iran. His reign started amid controversy. Over the subsequent decades, there were a number of attempts on the Shah's life, and many attempted coups in Iran. My father's suspicions certainly spurred me to search the UK's National Archives for any supporting evidence, but I couldn't find any. So I was intrigued when Jessie got in touch with me and told me of her grandmother's thoughts about the crash that killed her husband, who clearly enjoyed a very interesting career which Jessie is researching. Jessie, thank you so much for being willing to talk to me. How did you find Blighty Thank God? And What made you listen to it?
Oh, it was a good old-fashioned Google search, Neil. I was looking into my grandfather's life, Jessie Childs, who was a diplomat and an international civil servant and a bit of an adventurer. And I've never really known much about him at all. I'm a historian of the 16th and 17th centuries, so I'm normally ensconced in those archives. And up popped your podcast. And so I had a listen. I had a very good listen. It chimed in with the facts, the bare bones, which is that I knew that he had died in a plane crash somewhere between Iran and Iraq, between Tehran and Baghdad, I think I was told, somewhere over the mountains.
So you knew about how Stephen died. What else have you found out about him?
I subsequently found out that Stephen had actually written his memoirs. So I have a lot about his life up to 1935, and then not very much afterwards. And I can tell you that he was a small man. He was only about 5'6", and he had terrible, terrible eyesight. So he did recount one story that he enlisted in World War I when he was only 17, and he'd failed the medical because of his terrible, terrible eyesight. But he challenged the doctor to a tennis match, and he'd said, if I win the tennis match, it proves that my eyesight is good enough to fight for my country. So it was a 5-setter, very, very close, but he did win. And so off he went, and he fought in the First World War. And soon after that, he saw an advert in a newspaper asking for someone to work on a specialist newspaper. So he applied for that and he got the job, and off he went to Russia as a very young man, caught up in all sorts of adventures and dangers there. And all the time he was reporting to the British government.
What of the research materials you found told you about him and his wife, Lara, your Russian grandmother?
He had a very good sense of humour. That comes out in his memoir and his letters. And indeed, actually, there's an obituary in the Times after the plane crash. And it says, quote, he was an indefatigable worker. He had a cool, shrewd, and most resourceful mind, and also a keen sense of humour. His hero actually was Lawrence of Arabia, who was also very short. I think he had a bit of a sort of hang-up about that. He was the third of 4 brothers from Hendon. He was not public school educated. He wanted to go to Oxford, but then the war intervened. I think he always felt that he was a bit of a misfit, actually, as did Lara, the Russian, in all these different countries and places. And after the adventures in Russia, in fact, they ended up in Constantinople, as then was now Istanbul. And he worked for the League of Nations, resettling refugees. So and then he worked for the International Labour Organization. So he had a strong social conscience. I think he had a pretty good moral compass. But yeah, I think one of the joys is sort of reading the letters. You probably found this with your father's diary as well, Neil. You sort of pick up their voice. You pick up their sort of turns of phrases and certain idioms. And yeah, it's lovely.
Yes, I agree. It really is nice. But what was Stephen doing in Tehran before the fateful crash in which he died?
Well, he'd been in the Second World War. He was working for the Ministry of Information and the Foreign Office, as far as I can tell. And prior to Tehran, he had been the press attaché, the British press attaché in Belgrade, then in Paris, just before Paris fell. So he was there when the Nazis invaded. Then he subsequently went to America. But Stephen's job in America was essentially to help persuade the Americans into the war with propaganda there. So after the Americans entered the war, Tehran was next. And as you know, it was very, very important at that time. The British and the Russians had just invaded Iran and occupied it following Barbarossa and the German invasion of Russia, mainly to secure the Anglo-Iranian oil, but also the so-called Persian corridor to get these Lend-Lease American supplies up from the Persian Gulf up into Russia. So Iran was sort of seen as the bridge to victory. So Stephen was there to help with propaganda there and generally to sort of try and improve the relations, which were pretty bad. I mean, obviously the British were not popular at that point.
My father mentions in his diary that he felt the crash that killed Stephen was suspicious. What did your grandmother think?
She didn't think it was an accident. She thought there was something fishy going on. And the reason, as it's filtered down to me, through her son, my father, and then through my mother, who's still alive, who is recounting all these stories to me. Lara always thought that it was a bit fishy because there were lots of high-ranking spooks on board. That's what she'd said. Now, that could have been slightly distorted in the telling. That's why it really sort of pinged when I heard your podcast and read your father's diary, because he sort of is saying the same thing, isn't he? I did not know and had not heard until your father's diary about the possibility that the Shah might have been on board. I do buy the story that it's a crash. It was clearly atrocious weather. There was snow, there was fog, there were blizzards. It seems to me that it did simply just crash in the mountains. But it is interesting reading the reports to see who was on that flight, including 4 very, very senior Iranian officials, 1 general, 3 colonels of the Persian Air Force, as it was then.
Jessie, you kindly shared an archive file you unearthed on the crash and the passengers. Apart from your grandfather, who else stood out for you? Any spooks, spies, or intelligence officers?
One person does stand out, and yes, it's this chap, Group Captain Robert Ritchie Greenlaw, MBE. And he was air attaché in Tehran at the time. And according to this file, though they only admit it in 1952, so 9 years after the crash, he was, and I'm quoting now, the last appointment of above named officer, in other words, Greenlaw, was SDL. Now that's the special duties list. On appointment as air attaché Tehran. And then there's a little extra bit that says previously employed as intelligence officer. So whether he was on official duty on that flight and was officially spying then or not, we don't know, but he certainly had been spying.
In looking at the correspondence after the crash, it seems that Greenlaw wasn't just a spy looking for secrets. He had some of his own, didn't he?
Yes, there's quite a lot of scandal. There was this wonderful letter in there, and it's all sort of to do with trying to reclaim his effects and his money. He's got a wife at home who wants maintenance, or an ex-wife. And it all gets very tangled because there are clearly various women involved, including someone wonderfully called Madame Gregorian. And he had some of her jewels and some of her money on him when the plane went down.
So what's next with your plans for the book on your grandfather? Is there much to do?
Oh, my goodness, there's so much to do. And I still feel sort of in the early stages. There's a lot of travel. My grandfather he seemed to be a sort of cat with 9 lives until Tehran. He'd been in a plane crash before. He'd been in a shipwreck in Buenos Aires. He'd been stuck in the jungle in Bolivia, face to face with a jaguar. He'd been torpedoed in the Atlantic. I mean, there all sorts going on. So I've got a lot of travel to do. The one person left is my mother, who's in her 80s. It's wonderful. She'll I'll be having lunch with her and she'll just suddenly say something like, oh, yes, Laura thought Wallace Simpson was ghastly. And I'm like, oh, why do you say that? And did they meet? And she'll say, oh, yes, in the Bahamas in 1940. So that sends me sort of scrambling along. And I've found British Pathé footage of my grandparents behind Wallace and Edward in the Bahamas in 1940. So it's sort of wonderful little bits of serendipity like that. So it's keeping me going. Lots of archives to look at, lots of things to find out.
The Air Ministry file on the crash that Jessie shared with me contains letters written to and from the relatives of those killed. And as she highlighted in our discussion, one victim's name dominates: Group Captain Greenlaw, MBE. He was one of the British diplomats accompanying the Iranian military. As Jessie described, he was a spook or spy. In life, Scotsman Robert Ritchie Greenlaw enjoyed a career that saw him rise from World War I pilot to the senior ranks of the RAF by early into World War II. But in death, he left behind a tangled web of relationships that must have caused a nightmare for the RAF pen pushers who tried to navigate what emerged after the crash with gentlemanly discretion. The first hint of something intriguing arrived in a letter from London-based solicitors, Day & Son, acting for the executor of Greenlaw's will.
There are rather special circumstances surrounding the affairs of the deceased, and we should be obliged if you could kindly afford us an interview.
Now, the file doesn't reveal whether a discreet interview happened, but we do learn that Greenlaw's widow desperately needed official notification of her husband's death. Confusingly, that's despite the RAF contacting her at the address they had on file, naming her as Greenlaw's next of kin. Then, on a handwritten note in the file, there's a clue to the mystery of whether Greenlaw's next of kin is his wife or another lady.
Spoke to Mr. Hammerley. Group Captain Greenlaw has an unmarried wife, but whether she's the one we are writing to, he does not know.
The plot thickens when an official 4-page report from no less than the RAF's Commander-in-Chief in the Middle East arrives in London.
Group Captain Greenlaw's affairs are complicated by claims put forward by 3 civilians in Tehran with whom he was intimate, namely Madame Emma Gregorian, Madame Helene Hanklin, and Mr. Amini, a local merchant. They had entrusted to him substantial sums of money to be expended on their behalf in Cairo. Greenlaw was to bring back with him goods which he had been deputed to purchase. They now claim that their money should be repaid.
We also learn that a note was found on Greenlaw's body, detailing his intended shopping plans for when he arrived in Cairo, the flight's eventual destination. He also had a load of cash and some jewellery that one of the women chasing the RAF claimed was hers.
Mrs. Greenlaw was on very affectionate terms with her husband. If these matters come to her knowledge, serious distress will be caused to her, as she is likely to divine the nature of the relationship between her late husband and Madame Gregorian.
It suggests that if the solicitors Day & Son can be discreetly tipped off, then they might be able to protect Mrs. Greenlaw from discovering what her husband was up to while he was living and working thousands of miles away from her. For the RAF's desk pilots in London, thousands of miles from the original crash site, the problems surrounding Group Captain Greenlaw were getting closer to home and ever more complex. In October 1943, they received 2 angry letters from Mrs. Greenlaw's sister, who clearly didn't know her late brother-in-law had been killed.
My sister was separated from her husband a few years before the war. She was receiving a monthly allowance through the bank. But when the war started, she was in France and unable to return. When her husband knew she was there, he stopped paying her allowances. Would you please remind my brother-in-law to pay his wife's allowances to the bank, as he does not answer me when we ask? I would be much obliged if you don't give him my address.
How that sad family saga ended and whether all the parties were satisfied isn't revealed in the file's contents. But it does reveal what the British officials calculated was at stake nationally if Group Captain Greenlaw's various activities came to light.
And there's this great quote in the letter that said, "It will, quote, undoubtedly involve very considerable scandal at the expense of the late Group Captain Greenlaw." And then it goes on to say, "British prestige may also be brought into some disrepute. And this is a consideration of importance in view of the somewhat delicate Anglo-Iranian political situation." I love that. It's a very wonderfully sort of British piece of damage limitation.
I dug into the crash file Jessie shared out of journalistic curiosity and a sense of sheer amazement. But like researching my father's diary, it brought the people alive that I encountered in it. Yes, sometimes things were messy, But their lives had colour. They had struggles, they had complex relationships, and they sought happiness or riches in different ways. It transformed their two-dimensional names on a page into three-dimensional individuals. These were the people who played parts in a huge human drama we call World War II. My grateful thanks to Jessie Childs for getting in touch and being willing to be interviewed. Please visit her website, www.jessiechilds.com. It lists the books that have gained her such esteemed recognition. She is an amazing storyteller of the 16th and 17th century. The full interview with her is available on the podcast website, www.blightythankgod.co.uk. Links to the interview and to Jessie's website are in the show notes.